Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy. This is a quick editorial note about what you're about to hear. In this episode, I'm talking with Carl Smith, and early in the episode, I referenced last week and basically positioning this episode as the second of 3 episodes in a series about time perspectives. Well, it turns out between the posting of the first and second episodes, we had the whole COVID-19 coronavirus crisis show up really heavily in the news with all kinds of cancellations and news about people being put in a remote work setting that weren't historically in a remote work setting. So we made an editorial decision to insert an episode to help leaders that find themselves suddenly leading remotely. And this week, we return to the 3-episode series about time perspectives. So everything you hear in this episode that references last week was actually 2 weeks ago by the time this episode will appear on the Talk Like a Leader podcast. Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast. This week, we're going to continue the conversation we had last week. So Carl Smith is back with me again. Carl, how you doing, man?
Hey, guys. Good being back.
So we're going to continue the conversation we had about time perspectives. And this will be one of 2 episodes targeted at the 2 halves of the DISC model that tend to be maybe the most friction causing when it comes to time perspectives. We're going to talk first this week about what it means to have a task-oriented perspective with regard to time, both how can you be misinterpreted or misunderstood because of your perspective, and 2, how you can develop awareness and sensitivity to someone who doesn't have your perspective. And we'll pick it up again next week. We'll turn it around and go, what does it mean if you have a people-oriented perspective? So this week, our discussion is around the task-oriented perspective with regard to time. So I guess I'll just start and talk about what is a typically true thing about people who have a task perspective. And a little reminder, we're building this around the terminology used in the DISC model. There are other episodes in the Talk Like a Leader podcast series about the DISC model, and our website, DISCpersonalitytesting.com, has a number of blog articles and resources there to help expand your knowledge of the model. This week, we're talking specifically about time perspective. Okay, so from a task-oriented perspective, and I'm going to share my view of time, and then we'll talk with Carl about how that sounds to him from a people-oriented perspective. What does it communicate to him when I bring this perspective to the table? My natural perspective of time is focused on results and efficiency. I tend to be blended a bit with both dominant and cautious traits, primarily cautious traits, but I got enough dominant traits to kind of have a view into that view of the world. And so I tend to view time in terms of how much can I get done in this amount of time? How efficiently or effectively can I use my time? If I'm interacting with another person and something about that interaction causes me to, quote, lose time, I'm probably more frustrated with the loss in time or the loss of productivity or the loss of efficiency than I am with what the missing time means in terms of our relationship. I don't tend to view it, so say if Carl is late to a meeting with me, I don't tend to view it through the filter of Carl doesn't like me or Carl doesn't appreciate me. I tend to view it through the filter of Carl just wasted my time. Carl made me not get stuff done. There are things I could have been doing if Carl had been here, and now I'm annoyed with Carl. And all of a sudden we spiral out of control. Okay, so if I bring that perspective to the table, a pretty rigid view of time, and to like everything we do, whether it's business or social, I don't make any allowance for different contexts. It's always the same rigidity of focus. What does that communicate to you, Carl? What do you hear in that, or how does that make you feel?
Good question. So ironically, I had this same conversation with my son this week and last week, and he pointed out you're more focused on the task than me. And that resonated with me, and I was like, oh my goodness, he's definitely my son, because that's what can cross my mind as well if I'm not focused on just my own perspective.
So you can start to lose perspective on how it affects the other person. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, and so one of the things that I have to continuously from a people perspective, that's me working with someone that from a D and C perspective or task perspective, is to constantly think their way. But one of the ways that rigidity, as you said, can come across as no room for error. It's very specific. It is all about the task and little bit of flexibility.
Does it put you, let's say that you and I are interacting and we're talking about a meeting or something like that, and I'm super rigid about the start. I don't have flexibility or graciousness to make room for things that are going on in your life or situations you face. I'm incredibly rigid. Does that communicate to you a message about the health of our relationship?
Yes. Well, what it does is it actually puts me on guard.
So it sounds like, and going back to something we talked about earlier in another episode about this unintentional threat triggers, when I'm super rigid about time, it sounds to me like it can cause you to feel just a tiny bit threatened in the security and safety of our relationship.
Yes.
And I'll say that if it happens repeatedly over time, multiple times, that you're consistently late and consistently don't honor my time, it will eventually start to damage my view of you and hurt trust. And interestingly enough, it actually makes me focus more on whether I trust you or not, rather than whether I like you or not. So there's insight into how it tends to trigger for me. I start to equate that to trustworthiness. And so it will eventually start to wear on me. And interestingly enough, if it's a one-off thing, once we've had a conversation about it, gotten it fixed, I'm moving on. I probably won't think about it again.
See, and that's a really good insight for people to recognize.
And so the thing I guess I have to be aware of is that in my approach to time, I can communicate to other people that I'm, from their perspective, too rigid and inflexible, and therefore don't like them or appreciate them. When in fact, that's not what I'm thinking. I'm not even thinking about whether I like or appreciate them. I'm thinking, I got stuff to do, dude. So can we just get on with it? I've said my piece about the fact that you're late. Let's move on.
Yes. I can relate to that.
And unintentionally, what I suspect is going on in your mind, if I'm too harsh about that, is you're a little on guard with me. You're a little hesitant now. You're afraid that I'm angry with you. And even if it's in the past for me. Is that fair?
Well, even another way of saying it is it's a distraction for me.
It's a distraction for you. Okay.
Yes. So for instance, even getting on this call, we had something pop up with one of our team members I need to address. And the guy said, yes, we're going to meet at a specific time. And I'm scrambling just to make sure I meet because we're talking about time, and I need
we're talking about time.
That. But the thing that those internal triggers that can kick in from my perspective is this, if I don't meet that time, then my perception is working with this other person that's very conscious about time and very focused about time. The time is more important than me. And that's the area that I have to just for people that tend to be very focused on time and time commitments, just keep that in the back of your mind.
So it can come across like I care more about time than I care about you as a person.
Yes, absolutely.
And that message communicated enough times eventually does start to hurt our relationship.
Yes.
And I guess it's fair to say we're getting close to the end of our time for this episode, and we're going to come back and talk about the people owner perspective and how that can be misunderstood in the next episode. I think the warning for people who have a task owner perspective is not so much that you need to give up your focus on time, not so much that you need to not care about effectiveness or efficiency. It's more the idea that it's a good idea for you to be aware of how that focus can be communicated to others. And I think both Carl and I would agree that different situations call for different focus. For example, one of the things we talked about before we even started this discussion was that if you have a business that starts at 8 o'clock and you have posted hours that say it opens at 8, then probably you ought to open at 8 because you're going to annoy people if you're not there. If you have a party that starts at 8 p.m., I don't necessarily know that I need to apply the same level of rigidity to it. And those two are probably pretty obvious. The key is that they are different situations, and there's a situational awareness to it.
Yes.
And we need to be aware of our own personal biases so that we don't carry them, so we don't project those biases on every situation without regard to the context.
Yes.
There are situations where you need to be rigid about time. And there are situations where maybe you need to be a little more flexible about time.
Yes.
Part of the art of talking like a leader is to be aware of your bias and be able to adjust to that so that you can be sensitive to the messages you send to others. So here's a warning for people with task-oriented traits. People who, like me, are very focused on time and time efficiency and what it means to start at a precise time. Be aware that that every situation doesn't demand that rigidity. Be okay with flexing when flexing is appropriate, and be prepared to offer some grace, at least occasionally, to people. Again, not every single time, at least occasionally. Be sensitive to the idea that the person with whom you're interacting may or may not have that same rigidity of focus on time, and to them 9 o'clock might mean 9:05. That doesn't mean they're a bad, deficient person. That means there was lack of specificity during the communication. We weren't clear in what our intentions were, and we left up to interpretation what the other person would take out of our communication. And ultimately, that's on us if we're the leader. Mm-hmm. So for this week, let's wrap it up here and say, if you will learn, so let's say you have a task owner perspective, learn to be flexible and be specific. If you mean start at 9, then learn to say we're starting at 9. Learn to have very clear, specific communication rather than leave it open to interpretation. And at the same time, remember that some situations will demand you to have grace and to cut some people slack. Give them the flexibility to be who they are without demanding that they be you. If you can manage those things, you can talk like a leader. This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.